On day 22, we'll start chapter 7. Now, you may have started chapter 7 on day 21. So, why take an extra day? You may have spent some time now drawing your maps, drawing maybe some compositions, at least one for your cover. And you may have needed a little extra time. And chapter 7 really will take you to the end of your book. It's now the beginning of the last section of your book. So you can take a lot more time with your other chapters right here. You've already finished chapter 6. You've already finished maybe the most important chapter in your book, the climax. So now you can relax a little bit more. Now, chapter 7 is an encore chapter, just like chapter 4. But the main difference between the first encore and the second encore is that the second encore is placed right after the climax. Now, what does that imply? In terms of environments, you'll have to visit environments till your last chapter, so you have to present environment in chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now, can you at this point discover a new environment? You can. It depends on how you focus your story, how you focus the advancement of your story, and how you want to rhythm your story. Can you meet new characters? Well, at this point, you want to have met all the main characters of the story. Every main character has been presented. So, the protagonist, her supporters, the antagonist, if she's still alive, her supporters, and the menace. So all the main characters are known. But on chapter 7, or even chapter 8, you can still present another secondary character. It may not be too late for that. Finally, the main difference between chapter 4 and chapter 7, and between the first and the last encore, is that now you're trying to acquire resources with the end in mind. No, not just the resolution of a problem in the story, but a resolution of the story itself. So now, all that's related to gathering resources, finding new allies, or reinforcing your relationships with your existing allies, lies in the achievement, the end of the story. Encore chapters are presented this way. You discover a new setting, you advance through your story, you find a place to rest because you need to think on how to resolve your next issue, your next problem. And finally, you try to develop a sense of comfort in order to prepare for the next effort. Now, chapter 7 follows this structure. Exactly. The main difference with chapter 4 here will be in the definition of the term new. Will you visit a new setting? Well, not necessarily, but in most cases you'll have to visit a new section of a setting, a new part of a setting, and it may not literally be a new room. You may revisit the same room, but with new features. The encore, post-climax, has one specific thing, one specific difference. The discovery now, the discovery idea, is not completely over, but it has to be more focused. If you're discovering new pieces of information, and you have to, you're not at the end of the story yet. In chapter 7, in chapter 8, in chapter 9, and in chapter 10, you'll have to find new things. But what characterize these? Now, as a starter, you can discover new locations. You're at chapter 7, but you're only at chapter 7. You have some time left. You may even be writing a 12th chapter books, because if you followed the episodes on improvisation and how to articulate scenes, you may be now capable of writing more than 10 chapters, or you may envision more than 10 chapters, you may say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna stop at 10, but if I could rewrite this story, I would add this element and this element, and that would make you 2 additional chapters. So you still have plenty of time. You have 4 whole chapters. You can present at least 2 new whole environments. But it's not a necessity. It's just a possibility. You have the freedom to add this. Now, discovery in this case, whether you're presenting a brand new environment or just rediscovering one, should be focused on developing characters' motivations. What are they wants and what are they needs? The characters, until then, had specific reactions in specific situations because they have specific behaviors which define them. We have 4 layers to what makes a character. The first layer is identity, then you have behaviors, then you have habits, and then you have actions and reactions. So your characters are defined by these behaviors and by these reactions. Now, how does it translate in the context of chapter 7? Well, chapter 7 follows chapter 6, and chapter 6 is the climax. So your characters should have reactions toward one another. What did they do in chapter 6? Did they fail? Did they flee? Did they succeed? Did they solve a problem but had to cause another trauma in order to solve this problem? Characters' relationships will be put into light through their reactions, especially during a crisis or just after. Finally, when it comes to environments and the places you may have not visited yet, your environments, you designed them because now you have a full map of your world. You have a full map of your world, and in the regional map episode, you have been introduced to the concept of perspective shift. You know that you can develop a large scale environment into a very narrow scale just to put into light a very specific aspect of this environment which wasn't obvious. It may be a hidden, a voluntarily hidden aspect, hidden by an organization, for example. But it could also be something that's not obvious, something that's difficult to see, something that has to be delved into in order to be found. And your characters, because they now have so many information, they have so many valuable information, they might now decipher the great question of your story. They may now be almost able to fully answer the question of your story, and they might now be able to find these hidden places in previously visited locations. Every environment is defined by its identity. Quite obvious. And in the case of the environment, we don't use the word origins or identity as we use for character. We'll use the word soul. But this because you've already written chapter 2. You've already written chapter 4. And chapter 2 and 4 focus on this notion of soul, of how to depict an environment, how to create an atmosphere for this environment. Climate, the light, and the colors. And like in chapter 2, like in chapter 4, this rule applies to chapter 7. You want to establish this soul if it's a brand new environment, or you want to re-establish this soul or redefine this soul if there were significant changes in your environment. Now, the inhabitants are key to establishing this, just like the resources. If you can properly display which inhabitants live into an environment, which resources define your environment, You're already capable to define if this environment is likely to change. And you're probably trained yourself to do this since chapter 2. But now it will appear. It will become much more clearer for you in chapter 7. Because chapter 7 has one specificity again. It's just after the climax. And the climax is a crisis. And every crisis has consequences on the world, on an environment, on its atmosphere, on its inhabitants, and on its resources. So the climax should have redefined the soul of multiple environments. It may have not affected a new found environment, a new environment that you're presenting now, because your climax may have destroyed, for example, a part of your world or rendered a part of your world completely barren. But the new environment you're presenting now may not have been touched by the crisis. So because this new world, this new part of your world, this new environment hasn't been touched by the climax, hasn't been touched by the crisis, because the same chapter applies, the same principle applies for chapter 4 to some degree, even if the crisis in chapter 3 was less violent than the crisis in chapter 6. The same rule applies for chapter 4 and for chapter 8 as well. This new land, this new territory, this new environment, its resources may have not been affected. And since now your character is needing these new resources, she may be drawn to this new environment. That's the continuity factor. Your character has to solve a problem, and now she may need to acquire all these new resources. And since all these new resources are not available in the last environment, she'll have to get to a new environment. And that's how your story progresses. It's twofold. The crisis destroys something, and something else has to be created, but it has to be created in a new environment, because this new environment offers new possibilities. There are no more possibilities in the last place we've been in. The influence factor here, the influence resources, is the only real resources out of them four which will create a bridge between the two environments. Because since your characters are getting from one environment to the next, since your characters, your main characters, your secondary characters, and the organizations of your world are getting from one part of the world to the next, the influence factor has been preserved. Not entirely, because now influence will change, because alignment may change, and the influence in the territory will change as well. Since now a large part of your territory may not be available anymore. The definitive differentiation factor between chapter 4 and chapter 7, or anchor 1 and anchor 2, will be the focus of the characters on achievement. Now, if anything in this episode, and anything in the course really, isn't properly, according to you, put into perspective, if you want more information, if you want more criterion, more criteria, more factor of differentiation between, for example here, chapter 4 and chapter 7, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Comment. Tell us, okay, the resource party of the course hasn't been developed yet enough, according to me, or the character part of this episode and hasn't been defined enough. I don't know how a character is supposed to behave in chapter 4, or I don't know how a character is supposed to behave in chapter 7. Okay, because we could tell that's in the video, but you could respond us. Yes, but I don't have the specific progression between chapter 4 and chapter 7 for a support character, for example. Well, next year, during the upcoming year, will provide you with a series of examples. Will provide you with a series of multiple story examples, through which will guide you from chapter 1 to chapter 10. We'll keep this 10 chapters structure for now. Maybe we'll change it after the, maybe at mid-year. But for now, we'll guide you in the upcoming year with examples of stories. And for now, if you already have questions, if you already want more details on which other resources we're considering, which other factor are to take into account when it comes to stakes, to issues, to competition, to a relationship between organization, don't hesitate to leave comments, and leave these comments in the corresponding video so we know which part of the course we have to expand on. Now back to achievement. You're starting to write chapter 7 and you have 4 chapters left. That's pretty good. The story is almost over, really. So now, what do you put in chapter 7, scene 2 and scene 3? As a reminder, a scene is improvised this way. The character go through a location. They eventually, and here it's especially important since we're at the end of the book, they eventually meet new characters, but these new characters don't have to be literally new characters. These characters will have problems. These problems will engender stakes, and these stakes will lead you to a specific resolution, and this resolution is integrated. The means of resolution are integrated in the environment in which the problems appears. So that's your go-to formula in terms of improvisation. Now, how do you articulate the achievement principle with this simple structure? First thing you want to do is to focus on achievement. You want to be, from now on, even more deliberate. You're finishing this story. You're finishing this first book. This book, and you want to refine your intention. You want to refine your scenes, and by refining here, you may understand shorten. No, you may want to write shorter scenes from now on. It's not a rule. It's just an easier way to finish your book faster, because you may be a little bored of your story because now you've written 7 chapters almost, and you've started to develop your sense of improvisation a lot. So you may think to yourself, okay, I liked this idea in the beginning, but now I'm going to get to the next story because I want to write this next story. I think it's more interesting. So you may be a little bored of your actual story, or you may be impatient to reveal the end of the story because you absolutely enjoy this story, but what you enjoy the most is the end. And that's a thing that appears when you write the end first. When you start with the end, you start with the best. But now you're redacting the full story. You have to wait before getting to the end. And now you're getting impatient. Or it might be a third thing. It might be, I like my writing, but I think I've had enough training for this story, and I'd like to try a new genre. I want to train more, but I want to train differently. And that's where refining comes into place. Now, your character will need new resources, obviously. And these resources will all be focused, will all be directed to, will all be attributed to finishing the book. Now, finishing the book and finishing the story may appear to be the same thing. But really, if you have multiple books already in your mind, because again, you're in chapter 7, so you've developed a great sense of improvisation, and you may want to write new books right now, or you may want to film new movies, or you may want to program your new game, your future game, or if you're a musician, you may have already, have the flexibility to apply all this principle to your new album, and that's the same thing, because you're narrating here. So you may be at the end of your book, but not at the end of your story yet. And that's where the concept, and it will not look obvious. So again, in the comment section, add a little something up. Okay, what's the difference between book and story? You developed that, but that was not enough. Okay, we're gonna get to the last concept in this episode, and that's the concept of influence. So we talked about it a little earlier when we had our little reminder on resources. Now, why is influence critical by the end of chapter 7? No, by the end of the scene 3 of chapter 7. Let's give you a little insight on our next episode. Our next episode will be the relationship map. And by relationship map, we mean just that we'll learn how to establish a full relationship map. So a map of all the relationships between your characters. So now if you have 30 minutes a day to dedicate to this project, you'll have something like 4 or 6 characters. Okay, so you have only the core of the map. But if you have an hour a day to dedicate to it, 2 hours, you can go for as big as 12 characters. So the 4 main character or the 6 main characters in the core of the map, and 6 others in the radius of the map. And that's where influence takes all its power from. Because now you're at the end of chapter 7. You should have introduced all your essential characters. Again, you can still introduce a tertiary characters in chapter 8 or 9 or 10, but it will be a little more difficult, so we don't recommend it. But all your main characters should have been presented. In fact, see it this way. As soon as you've presented the menace, as soon as you've introduced the menace in chapter 6, that's the last character you'll present. That's the last important character that you'll present. All the other characters that are presented after the menace are not essential. They're not essential, or they're only defined by their function. So that's really where influence comes into the picture. Because each character, and if we get back moment to the reaction generating factor, you realize that every character, you realize it's the third time now that we see that, you realize that every character reacts because of attachment. But another word for attachment is influence. It's not the same thing, but influence is defined by familiarity. Influence is defined by predictability, by reliability, by the fact that you have an attachment to a certain person, wherever it's through your alignment, through the affinities. And so, as you're now building the end of the story, and the climax really may have been the highest point of your story. It may not be, because you want to have the highest point in your story in chapter 10 or in chapter 12. But the climax may have been the highest point of your story. Still, you don't want to sacrifice the rhythm of your story. So you don't want it to become boring now. So you have to build from the end of chapter 7 to the end of chapter 10 a growing tension. Now, it will not be the same tension as what happened in chapter 6, because what happened in chapter 6 was world-breaking. Now, the growing tension you'll build from chapter 7, or no, the beginning of chapter 8, because it's the end of chapter 7, to the end of chapter 10 will be a tension in the character's relationship, because attachment, again, attachment or influence, is the way to create paradoxes in relationships. It's the way to create love relationships, hate relationships. You create strong relationship when you create attachment, and that's why, again, that's the aim for this course, creating emotional attachment with the public. And when this attachment grows, when this influence grows, you can be sure that there will be a strong reaction at the end of the story, at the end of the book, at the end of what your character's relationship may become. So influence is critical to preserve the rhythm of your story, or to redefine the rhythm of your story, to build the tension up to chapter 10. And now we'll give you a glance of what we're going to do next time. Based on the role map, based on the 6 roles we presented to you since the beginning of this course, we'll establish a relationship map. And this relationship map will be the establishment of the interaction between the different characters which bear these roles, and 6 others. Now, what will be defining these 6 other characters? Well, these 6 additional characters may be, because you have at least 2 main possibilities, but let's find 3 for now. Maybe a repetition of these roles. For example, you can have 6 main characters which have these 6 roles, and 6 secondary characters which have this 6 role also. Or these 6 additional characters may be defined following the visual profile schema. And it is especially useful for some secondary characters or tertiary characters. So we have the 6 roles, we have the 4 profiles, but we also have the geographical attachment, since all characters have an origin. You may argue that your tertiary characters are almost exclusively defined by these origins. So by placing a specific character in a specific location in the beginning, and then displacing her in another location, and then another location, will or may change her behavior. But this concludes chapter 7 with the importance of influence, inner and outer. Next time we'll see the relationship map, and we'll see the effect on influence from character to character.